seat. Great. Just wanted to make sure everybody was awake here. So Luke chapter 10 is where we're going to be. And guys, we are talking about relationships. That's what we're going to be talking about. We've been for 2 weeks. This is now our third week, and we're going to do at least 2 more. We'll see where we are on the other side of that. But when we talk about relationships, these are some of the things that we have been saying. So relationships, as Adam had kind of set us up with this, these are just some things that relationships are. One is that they're for our mutual sanctification. Big theological word that simply means relationships are intended to make us more like Jesus, right? To make us more holy, to walk us in that path. Okay, relationships are also to teach us to be servants, all right? Which is not the way we typically think about relationships. Sorry, my thing's slipping here. We tend to think of relationships about as what we get from them, but rather from a biblical perspective of what relationships are, we're talking about what we can give, right? How we can serve other people. Relationships are for us to love with Christ-like love in that fashion, and relationships are for us to share the gospel. We're actually going to talk about that a little more tonight. But Adam left us with this thought pertaining to familial relationships. That is, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, things of that nature, okay? The home is a training ground for us to prepare for the real world. And I don't know if you, thank you, Chris. I don't know if you guys grasped that at all because we were running for shelter from a tornado. Am I good? All right. But that was one of the ideas that Adam left us with last week, was that the home is a training ground for us to be preparing for the real world. So I want to talk about the real world tonight. I want to talk about community. So when we talk about relationships tonight, we're going to be talking about the relationships that we have in our schools, in our actual physical neighborhoods where we live, right? But I'm specifically talking about people that are outside the church tonight, okay? That is people who do not call on the name of Jesus Christ. People that are outside the church. Now, those are, we might call those secular relationships. That is outside the church. That's all that word means, okay? But the Bible doesn't really talk about, specifically at least, how to love peers, how to love classmates, teammates, coworkers, if you have those, etc. But it does talk about how to be a good neighbor, all right? So that's the lens that we're going to look at tonight. This is probably a very familiar story for most of us. But when you guys think about a neighbor, you probably have the same impression that I do, which is that typical, sitcom impression of a neighbor, right? Which is some person that you're forced to live next to, okay? That's usually what we think of when we think of a neighbor, okay? I think of oh my goodness, from Home Improvement. I'm losing his name. Wilson, thank you. Wilson. It's on the tip of my tongue. I think of Wilson, although he's a good neighbor, right? Tim is the bad neighbor. But anyway, I just for fun, looked up some stories about terrible neighbors on the internet, true stories about terrible neighbors on the internet. So these are just 5 of my favorite ones that I found. And this first one that I'm going to give you, I was actually crying laughing as I was reading this. I'm just going to give you a little snippet of it. But there was a police officer who he responded to a disturbance call where 2 neighbors were blowing leaves at each other with leaf blowers, right? So these guys got in an argument probably about whose tree the leaves really belong to, right? They clean their yards. They probably have some pre-existing issues between them, right? But the police officer has to respond because these 2 guys are blowing leaves at each other, right? And screaming and yelling, and somebody called and reported this disturbance, okay? They were actually mad at each other while they were doing this. It wasn't just a fun leaf fight or something, okay? So that's one thing, true story about terrible neighbors, okay? This is another one. One neighbor apparently wrote or called and complained to the homeowners association that another neighbor's cat was staring at her. Again, probably some pre-existing issues here, right? The cat is staring at me, I want them evicted. Okay. How about this one? One homeowner had a house that was yellow. Their neighbor wouldn't stop complaining to them about how much they hated the color. When the homeowner was away, true story, on a business trip, the neighbor had it painted white and then tried to stick the homeowner with the bill when they came home. All right. How would you like to come home and find your house a different color? Okay. Bad neighbor. All right. Here's another good one. When a Florida man treated his neighbors to a Tampa Bay Buccaneers football game. Any Floridians in this room? Nobody? Okay, great. I'm a terrible team anyway. They probably thought they hit the jackpot, okay? But alas, that wasn't the case because authorities say that the man actually paid for the tickets with a credit card he'd stolen from the very same neighbors he'd invited to the game. Right? But that's not all. That's not all. He allegedly charged almost $3,000 in total to their card and made other purchases, including, for some reason, flowers, food bought from Panera Bread, and ironically, legal services. Legal services. You see the irony here? Okay. Right. He was charged with theft and fraud in 2015. This one is for David, Dawson, and the rest who are not. Oh, Dawson, there you are. Is David here too?
Yeah, he's downstairs.
David. Oh, there he is. He's a very good fellow. David, I have a quick little terrible neighbor story for you, and it's not really for you, but it involves a Canadian couple, so I thought you should hear this, okay? In 2013, true story, a Canadian couple unmasked a pile of manure so large that it could be seen on Google Earth and deposited it right at their neighbor's property line. No one's quite sure why they were so unhappy with their neighbors, but a judge found them guilty of using the poop piles as, quote, tool of harassment and ordered them to pay $15,000 in the dispute. All right? Just some examples here of some terrible neighbors, okay? Now, sort of when we think about neighbors, again, we just kind of have this impression of that's the guy who lives across the hedge from me. Sometimes I wave at him when I go to school, okay? And most of the time I just try to ignore him and pretend like he's not there, right? That's usually the way we think about neighbors. But I want us to redefine our concept of neighbors tonight, because I think what Jesus goes on to tell us here in Luke chapter 10 is that neighbor is a much broader concept for us. And it's much more helpful for you and I to read something like this in the Bible and actually put people in that category in order for us to really love them well. Does that make sense to you guys where we're going? Okay? So let's read this very familiar story. It's called the story of the Good Samaritan. Right? And Jesus is telling this story as an object lesson. All right? So it's a parable. It's not a true story, but it is true in the sense that it applies to the way human beings do morality. Right? Every single one of us can find ourselves in this story in some way, shape, or form. All right, so Luke chapter 10, I'm going to start in verse 25. It says, "And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him," that is Jesus, "to the test, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?'" Okay, good question. So he's asking good questions. Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law, and how do you read it?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." There's our neighbor word. And Jesus said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But he, that is the lawyer, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road. When he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, 'Take care of him. Whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back.' Which of these 3, do you think, proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" And he said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." You go and do likewise. Okay? So when we redefine neighbor according to the biblical parameters that we see here, okay, what we're actually talking about, you guys, is people with whom we have regular interaction, right? People that cross my path. And specifically for our purposes, when we're talking about our community and our neighbors, what I want us to really think about is, who's in my circle of influence? Who is in my circle of influence? Who are the people that I can reach out and touch, right? Because they're there all the time, right? Who are the people that I bump into in the hallway every day, right? Who are the people that I see on my commute across my street, right? Who are the people that I just interact with? Who's within my circle of influence? And so it's not merely somebody who just lives next to me, but rather, according to this passage, as we're going to unpack, someone whom you are biblically responsible to serve, to live life with, to encourage, fill in the blank. Okay? Different degrees of it, but every single person that we have in our circle of influence is somebody that is a neighbor that we're supposed to engage with in a loving a loving kind of way. Let's put it that way. Okay? So here's what I want us to say, though, as we think about this. First of all, before we get anywhere, the prerequisite to being a good neighbor is that I must love God. What's a prerequisite? Those of you who are just like done with school now, right? Your brains are fried. Do you know what a prerequisite is?
3 weeks before. So before being a good neighbor, you must love God.
Excellent. Before you are a good neighbor, you must love God. In order to be a good neighbor, you must love God. A prerequisite is something that comes before. All right. So I had the misfortune, because of my own stupidity and my own arrogance, when I was in school, I decided not to ever visit my guidance counselor. Okay, which is just a bad thing. You should do that. It's smart. Okay. But when I was finishing my bachelor's degree in English, and I came to the unfortunate realization that I could not take two of the same classes at the same time. I had to take them sequentially, one after the other, okay? Which meant that I had to take an extra semester, right? My last first day of school for English was one semester longer, right? Because I didn't pay attention. But there's a prerequisite. I had to get that class done in order to do the next class, okay? That was unfortunate. I learned my lesson, okay? You guys do the same thing, okay? But the prerequisite to being a good neighbor, what comes first in order for me to really do this well, is to love Jesus. To love my God. And I think we see that in the way that the lawyer even draws from the Old Testament to build his case here. He says in verse 27, he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself," right? And we call this like the greatest command, right? That this is like sort of one command together. It's two things put together in one, right? To love God and to love others. Okay, that's actually the theme of our youth group verse. And so that's an important concept, but loving God is the prerequisite to being a good neighbor. Loving the Lord means that I have faith in Him, but it also means that I delight in Him above all else, right? And I worship Him with the totality of my being. That is all that I am. Okay, we got heart listed here, soul, mind, strength, our emotions, and our deepest convictions, right? The immaterial things that we are, this inner person that I am, right? My mind, my reason, my intellect, my strength, my abilities, and how I use them, right? But what we see, you guys, is that just having the knowledge is not enough, right? Because the lawyer knows all this. He says, all these things, and Jesus says, "You've answered correctly. Now go and do it," right? Go and do it, and then you'll understand it. You'll have eternal life, right? And so what we see is that loving the Lord also involves obedience. It involves responding to what we know Jesus to be commanding us to do and doing it, right? Taking it and doing it, okay? As a matter of fact, the other people that Jesus brings into the story, we have a priest and a Levite, okay? Show of hands, how many of you guys think those guys are very religious people? The priest and the Levite. Very religious people, okay? Do they do anything with the knowledge that they possess about this injured man on the side of the road? They don't, right? And it's actually a Samaritan who is who's a totally different people group, totally different category, right? Who's the one who demonstrates some type of real understanding about what God would want for him to do with people, okay? So these guys that are supposed to be very religious, know a lot about the Bible, demonstrate a false religion, right? They demonstrate no real faith. They demonstrate no real connection or worship of God in their hearts because they're not willing to do something for this man who's injured, okay? James, the book of James, chapter 1, verse 27 actually says that religion that is pure and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So there's a doing that is necessary, not to earn salvation, right? We'll kind of turn that equation on its head here in a second, but rather because I have been saved, I live this out, and I glorify God by the choices that I make. As a matter of fact, if I love God, I must love others. That's why these two commands go together, right? You love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and you love your neighbor as yourself. Those two things go hand in hand, which is why in the book of 1 John, John writes this: "In this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent His only Son into the world so that we might live through Him. And this is love, not that we have loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation, that is the sacrifice for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another." Right? That, by the way, is the verse that's inscribed on the chairs in my wedding band. Okay? Because God loved us, we love others. Right? That's it. That's it in a nutshell. Okay? And so in order to really be a good neighbor, if we want to really love our classmates, the people that live across the hedge from us, okay, the people that are on my soccer team, well, I've got to have that concept in place, right? I've got to love my God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then out of that, you guys, all of a sudden it becomes, it's like a light switch turns on, and I'm able to see people differently. I'm able to engage with them differently based on it, okay? So here's the question, all right? As a Christian, the prerequisite to being a good neighbor is that I must love God. But here's the question: how must I live in a secular community, right? So you and I live in homes, you guys live with your parents, I'm assuming, okay? In different neighborhoods where there are people who don't love Jesus, probably. Okay? There's probably people that you interact with on a daily basis that don't love Jesus. And it's actually unavoidable. and necessarily unavoidable for us to like live life without rubbing shoulders with people who aren't Christians. Okay, and that's necessary for a couple of different reasons. But as we think about this, what are the priorities that you and I as Christians need to have in place so that we do that well, right? Not just like living side by side and ignoring each other, but really seeking to engage and not being, looking just like the rest of the world, but rather being different, right? These are the things that we need to have in place. So I'm just going to give you guys 3 things that we need to have in place in order to properly live in a world that is fallen, okay? The first thing is this. I need to take personal responsibility, okay? That is, I need to look at my own heart and look at my own set of tools that God has given to me, look at my resources, and look at my sphere of influence, who are the people around me, and take responsibility for it, right? And what I see here in this text is that the lawyer isn't willing to do that, at least not at first, right? Because what he says, as soon as Jesus says, you've answered correctly, do this, and you will live, it says, he desiring to justify himself said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor, right? And so there's a couple of things that, as you're reading this, your eyes might glaze over a little bit. You don't quite get exactly what's going on in his heart here. We're going to have to imply a couple of things. But it says that he desires to justify himself. And so he's kind of on the defensive by what Jesus says to him. He wants to make himself look good. Probably this conversation is happening in the midst of other lawyers, other people asking questions, probably a lot of people listening in, right? So he doesn't want to look like an idiot in front of Jesus, right? Where Jesus has kind of told him, yeah, you got it right, now go do it, right? And so he wants to say, well, that's a big category, neighbor, right? How do I identify who this is, right? And so what he's not willing to do is sort of accept that he needs to understand this a little better, for one thing, okay? But the lawyer was trying to exclude responsibility for himself and for others by making some people non-neighbors, right? You see what he's doing there? He's saying, who's my neighbor? Because, there's some people that I really don't want to love, essentially. There's some people that are unkind. There's this guy who piled a 1,000-foot pile of poop at the end of my yard, right? And I don't want to love that guy very well, okay? Probably not literally. But a more appropriate question here would rather be, how can I be a loving neighbor versus, well, who's the person that I have to love? Where's my checklist, right? Who are the people that I absolutely got to get, right? Rather, how can I be a loving neighbor versus just putting people on the list, okay? Because my responsibility as a Christian is first to glorify God and to love others, right? And when we think about what loving others means, we're really just kind of breaking this down to meeting their needs, whether they're small or gospel size, okay? Meeting needs, whether they're small or gospel size. But I can't expect others to do for me what I'm not willing to do for them. Okay? Now, let me get some honesty in the room. How many of you guys have ever tried to bribe a brother or sister to do something for you that you didn't want to do? Okay, great, awesome, fantastic. How many of you are little money launderers and actually at some point tried to photocopy a dollar bill or cut out some green paper and pass that off as real money to your sibling? And when they okay, great, fantastic, thank you. I just want to make sure I wasn't the only one. Okay, so interestingly enough, when we're in that position, right, we're Grant, I don't want to walk the dog. I'll give you $10 to go walk the dog. $10 might be extreme. I'll give you 50 cents to go walk the dog. Okay. All right, and do the dishes and do my homework and whatever else. Okay, and that's great, and I'm okay with that, right? But what happens when Grant turns around and says, "Hey, Justin, I really don't want to mow the yard. I'll give you 25 cents to do that," right? Am I not offended by that in some way? I don't have time to deal with somebody else who's asking me to do something for them, even when they're paying me, right? And so sometimes we are in a position where we expect things of other people that we then are not willing to give in return, okay? And what this equation is really setting us up for is that we actually need to be willing to give to meet a need, whether or not there's a response for it ever. All right? We'll look at that more in a second. But being a good neighbor to the lost means that I take the initiative to show kindness. I don't wait until kindness is shown to me. Okay? So in order to love my classmates well, my teammates well, my actual physical neighbor well, right? I have to take the initiative, the personal responsibility to show kindness and not just wait till it's given to me. I love that the description of the Samaritan, we don't know anything about this dude, okay? Except that it says in verse 33, when he passed by, when he's on his journey, he saw this man who was beaten and he had compassion. All right? Maybe the problem, you guys, is that, well, first of all, maybe the problem is that we don't have that prerequisite in place. Maybe I'm not loving God the way I should. And that's part of the disconnect between me and the other people in my life. That could be it. And if that's the case, that explains why we don't really feel anything for the other people around us, right? My heart isn't really broken for the needs of that guy who sits behind me in algebra, right? Or that person that I have on my soccer team who is kind of an outcast and the rest of the team doesn't really engage with them. Whatever the case might be, right? I just see that there's compassion that is being felt, like actually internally felt there by the Samaritan, and then it leads him to show mercy to this man, okay? And the reason, you guys, that we need to come back to this concept is because the reason why we show them, why we are commanded to do that, and why we should just naturally do that, is because you and I have been shown that ourselves, right? What did 1 John 4 say? But it's that God loved us, and that's why we love other people, okay? And I don't know about you, maybe you don't feel like God loves you a ton, or maybe you've not been saved off the street from a life of drugs, all right? And so that's not your testimony, and so it's kind of like, he brought me up in a Christian home. I did some, I lied to my sister once, and then I became a Christian. Now I'm sure. Okay, that might be your story. But the reality of sin, you guys, is that we have been forgiven so much, so much. It's not just that I did some bad things; it's that I was a bad person. I was a broken person, lost in my sin eternally, and God, being rich in mercy, decided to come and save me. Okay? And that's amazing. And so out of that gratitude, I should be willing to show compassion and love to other people. So, here's a couple of questions for you to just kind of take inventory on. Maybe you're sitting here saying, I don't even know my neighbor. I think his name's Bob. I saw him once. Okay. He was cutting his edges. It was weird. All right. Maybe you're saying, I don't even know my classmates. I kind of know some of their names. I say hi to them. We talk about music. All right. Take the initiative. Take the initiative to get to know them. Ask them questions. Say hello. Be friendly. Be kind. Be a neighbor. Okay. Maybe you have a bad relationship with some of those people. Right. Maybe some things have been said or done or implied that have hurt you or hurt some of those people. Take the initiative and make it right. All right. Whatever scenario you might find yourselves in, being a good neighbor to the lost, and again, we're specifically talking about not saved people, okay? It means that we have to take the initiative as Christians to show the type of kindness and love that God has shown to me. So that's number one. We'll move quickly through these other two. Number two is by resolving to be influential, that is, as opposed to being easily influenced. You see the distinction? Right? Being influential as opposed to being easily influenced. Okay? In other words, I need to maintain a spirit of holiness and integrity as a Christian that is going to rub off on somebody else. Not, I hang out with these non-Christian people and all of a sudden my vocabulary is full of the four-letter words that they use. Okay? It goes the other way. The influence goes the other way. Now, let me ask you this question, because I think this is an interesting one to ponder. Who do you think, in the story of the Great Samaritan, the Good Samaritan, he's just kind of okay. He's not a great Samaritan. In the story of the Good Samaritan, who do you guys think is the person who's the most impacted by the Good Samaritan's deed? Maybe this is a no-brainer, I don't know, but what do you think? I'm sorry? The dude that was beaten. Okay, so that's kind of what I was inclined to think. But then as I was looking through this again, there's another person in the story that I think is forgotten here. I think it's the innkeeper, right? Why? Why would the innkeeper be the one who's the most influenced by the example here? Sarah?
Because he sees the Samaritan doing all this stuff in his man, and it's giving him nothing.
Yeah, right. So just as an observer, right, who's actually, it's interesting. He's kind of receiving this wounded man into his own care, and now he's got a choice to make, right? Is he going to do what the Good Samaritan did, or is he going to kick him out and send him on his way, or something like that, right? I think the innkeeper, so the guy on the ground is obviously going to be influenced by this one way, shape, or form. But he's half dead. The scripture says he might not even know what's happening here, and apparently the guy's coming back in 2 days to continue paying for his bills. I don't know if a half dead man, unless he gets a magic potion, right, and I guess the use of his arms back is he's probably not going to recover in 2 days. Right, it's going to be a long recovery process. But I feel like the innkeeper is poised to be the guy who's going to learn in this example, right? He's kind of like the lawyer who's outside the story listening to the story, right? Because he sees this incredible example of compassion and mercy from a Samaritan who's caring for a man who's in need just because he happened to be going that way, right? And so we need to be thinking about the influence that you and I set for other people to see, okay? Now with that, we need to exercise a couple of things. If you were in our Bible study on Monday, we talked about this verse actually, but in Matthew 10, Jesus says this to his disciples, "Behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over the courts and flog you, that is, beat you in their synagogues. Okay? He tells them to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And so we need to exercise wisdom and discretion, right? We also need to exercise this integrity. And so a couple of thoughts here. One is, I must discern what the appropriate level of relationship is with this person. Okay? So let's take the guy who sits behind you in algebra, just hypothetically. Okay? Maybe he's a terrible person. Okay? Maybe he has no relationship with his parents, smokes, curses, does every single other cardinal sin that Christians shouldn't do. Okay? Probably don't want to be best buddies with him. Why? Why? Influences might go the wrong way. Okay? But does that mean you should avoid him? Not at all, right? Quite to the contrary. Like, you need to love that person, but you need to love them the right way. But as we practice the wisdom like a serpent, the serpent is like an imagery here, like somebody who's really cunning, thinks through things carefully, plans ahead kind of thing, okay? We need to discern what the appropriate level of relationship is with that person. I don't have the right to withdraw. I don't. As a Christian, I really don't, okay? But I do need to determine what is the appropriate level of relationship. Same thing with my neighbor, same thing with my coach, same thing with whatever person you want to put in the blank here, okay? But I also, with that, for the same reason, I must associate with non-Christians without acting like one. Because that's the danger of being in close proximity to somebody else, is that, as Shakespeare says, bad company corrupts good morals. Okay? So as we engage with one another, we need to be having a positive influence, not being easily influenced, right? But what I also see here, he says, beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts, flog you in the synagogues, and he goes on to list the whole litany of terrible things that non-Christians are going to do to people who bring the gospel, okay? We also shouldn't be surprised when people are rude or even violent when we share Jesus with them, okay? And for us, as Christians, the reality of this is that we are tasked to go. We are called to go, to do this. It is disobedience not to, okay? And so we do it regardless of what the response is going to be. Again, as we talk about response, there's the possibility that we might get, blank face, nothing, shut down, right? And we've got to kind of regroup and try again later, okay? There's also the possibility that that guy who sits behind you in algebra is going to say, get away from me, I don't want to ever talk to you again. How dare you criticize my lifestyle, you bigot, whatever, okay? And so we got to be prepared for that. We got to recognize that there will be negative response to the gospel to one way, shape, or form, and be prepared for that as we exercise wisdom and innocence and resolve not to be easily influenced. Okay, being a good neighbor, and that just means following Jesus' example. So let me skip to this last one here, so we're out of time. Our third idea here is this: resolving to be influential and being intentionally sacrificial. Okay. Literally inconveniencing myself. Right? It is a huge inconvenience to love other people. I don't know if you knew that. Right? Maybe that's why we don't do it very well. Right? We recognize it's hard, takes time, takes energy, takes resources, and I don't want to do it. Maybe that's why we don't do it. But the gospel calls us to and empowers us to do that. Okay? Look again at verse 27 here. Okay. So the man says, the answer to your question, Jesus, is that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said to him, you have answered correctly, do this. Okay? There's action that is required, all right? Now, for the priest and the Levite, okay, again, guys that are supposed to be really religious, supposed to be examples and leaders in the Jewish community, okay, they do nothing, right? They walk by and they decide to do nothing. And the text makes it very clear that this isn't like they didn't see him or didn't smell him because he probably stank, okay? But rather chose to walk on the other side of the road and not even go near him, okay? And so there's different reasons why, like people will hypothesize why they chose to do this. One of the examples is that to touch a dead body, if they assumed he was dead, would make them ceremonially unclean as a Jew, which would be terribly inconvenient, and that would take some time. But the issue is that if that's their biggest concern, like that's not even a permanent status, right? They go, they wash themselves, they present themselves in the temple, the priest says you're clean again, right? And that's it, okay? And so they weren't even willing to stop, inconvenience themselves in any way, shape, or form for this man who desperately needs help. Now, to the contrary, what are some ways, just look at those verses there, especially verses 33 to 37. What are some ways that the Good Samaritan inconvenienced himself for the sake of this injured man? Just call him out.
He set himself back some money.
he set himself back a good amount of money. Okay, as a matter of fact, if you have a footnote, you'll see that a denarii is a single day's wage, right? So he gave up 2 days worth of wages for this guy so far, and then promised to pay more in the future. Right, Ty?
He bound his wounds and poured oil and wine on him.
Yeah. All right. So wine is kind of a strange thing to pour on an injury, unless that's the only sanitizing thing you have on you. Okay. And so he's sacrificing his lunch essentially to like bind up this guy's wounds, right, and make him comfortable, right? Oh.
Lets him ride his animal.
Lets him ride his animal. All right. This is not a terribly long journey, but he's got a donkey. Why would he not want to ride it himself, right? Why would he not figure out some way to like sit up and have the other guy like tied on the thing behind him or something? I don't know, but he inconvenienced himself in that way. Sarah.
His time, he's probably going somewhere.
Yeah, right. He's on a journey. Okay, he's headed somewhere, and either detours or finds the next closest rest stop. Okay, to drop this guy off. Right. So he takes time out of his journey. Okay.
He makes a promise.
He makes a promise to return. Yeah. Again, no idea where he's going, but now he's got to go back. Okay, and pay for any other bills that this half-dead man might incur in his stay at the end. Okay. All kinds of ways, you guys. This guy inconveniences himself for this person. So you and I, as Christians, need to have that kind of mindset. We need to be intentionally sacrificial, going out of our way, bending over backwards for people. Part of that involves caring for people who are unloved and outcasts. Right? That's particularly hard, right? Especially if you're friends with a group of people who don't particularly want to associate with people who are sitting at that end of the lunch table, okay, or who are at that end of the gym and don't really want to play the game at the youth group on a Thursday night, okay, something of that nature, okay. We're talking outside the church. We're not talking about the church, okay. But like we need to care specifically for those people. And now the irony of this parable is that that's turned on its head here, okay, because who's a Samaritan to a Jew? Bad. Meaning an enemy, right? There's all kinds of bad blood between these two, okay? And so the person who in this story is the minority, is the outcast, right? Is the enemy, is the one who is now showing kindness for the person who is part of the community. Okay? So, did I sneeze? I'm sorry, okay. He turns it on its head, okay? But the question that we need to ask ourselves is, who is the outsider at school? Who's the enemy? Quote, okay? Who needs help, and it's in my power to do something about it, right? And help, you guys, could be as simple as, hello, I noticed you're by yourself, would you like some company? Okay? This guy goes above and beyond to care for a need that's here, right? Why are we so reluctant to inconvenience ourselves just to say hello to somebody? Just to get out of my comfort zone for 5 minutes to say 2 sentences to somebody that I might never even see again in the future. There's no excuse for us as Christians to not do that. What is the cost of really loving people who are outside? And the commitment is that it's regardless of response. The guy is going to wake up at some point. He may just like up and leave and never meet the Samaritan again. Never say thank you. You saved my life. Okay? Are we willing to go to that extreme? Okay. So here's the thing. Let's finish here. The prerequisite to being a good neighbor is that I must love God, and that drives the rest of what I do. But the goal of being a good neighbor is externalizing the love God has given me into the lives of those who are in my community. Right? The prerequisite is that I love God, and that gives me the motivation, the fuel, the power, fill in the blank, to do this. But here's the goal, that I would take the love of God that He's given to me and externalize it into the lives of people who are in my community. Again, community, we're talking about my sphere of influence. I'm not talking about every single person you meet. You've got to be like singing as you walk down the street and touching people and like saying, you're awesome and have a great day. Like, that's not what I'm after, right? With the people that you interact with, that you can make an impact in their lives, okay? Whether by kindness, whether by sacrificing time, you decide, okay? But that requires us to be attentive and care for the needs of others. Let me just give you a couple of what-if questions here, and we'll close with this. What if? What if? All right, I know it's summertime, but think with me. What if your goal on a school day wasn't just to pop in the earbuds, get through the classes, and get home without interacting with anybody? Do you know people like that at school? Are you a person like that at school? All right. What if that wasn't my goal? What if my goal was actually to do something else? Right? What if I wasn't so concerned with being accepted by other people and instead became much more concerned about being accepting of other people. Right? Let me turn that on my head, and rather than be so concerned about what other people are thinking every single second of the day, let me think about what other people might be experiencing and try to be more accepting of who they are and loving of them. Okay? What if you weren't so consumed with your own academic success and were more attentive to helping others achieve as well? What if instead of just, I'm so focused on making sure I get that A, I thought about how can I help somebody else who might be struggling in this class, right? That's not a spiritual need, but it is a way that I could begin to care for somebody and open the door for communication. Last one, what if you look for just some small ways to show care for your actual neighbors this week, right? More than just, hey, awkward, maybe inside, okay? Rather, let me engage with this person and show them love, okay? Let's close in prayer, guys. Just kind of think about those things. We'll go to our recap groups in just a second here. But what are the relationships? You probably have some people either in mind right now, or if you don't, I would ask you to ask the Lord to reveal them to you. Who are the people in your life that you could really begin to love well? Because again, this is a very gospel-centered type of relationship, right? When we engage with people that are in our community, whether they're school friends, teammates, neighbors, whatever, like the primary goal of that is to find an opportunity to share the gospel, to bring them the good news, right? It's not some weird like indoctrination kind of thing, like we must convert people, but rather, I love Jesus so much because of what he saved me from. I want to share that, right? If that's my goal, then I'm going to be loving, and I'm going to be kind, and I'm going to meet needs at the same time as I'm seeking to meet the need, capital N. Okay? Let's pray, and then we'll close. Father, thank you for your word.